Hi, everyone. It's Caroline here, and welcome to this week's podcast. If we haven't met already, I've spent more than 20 years working across media and the corporate world, watching how work changes from the inside. Each week on this podcast and the companion article on Substack, I dive into one topic that's reshaping work and what it means for you and for me. So today I'm staying in the world of AI at work. Last week I talked about what AI feels like when you're a specialist and the thing you've spent your life becoming really good at can suddenly be generated by anybody with a prompt. And my takeaway from that was asking people to approach that with a little more empathy. This week, I want to put the emotional argument aside and look at the practical one. What's actually likely to happen to the world of work and corporate work in particular if AI takes jobs from people with specialist skills and knowledge? So let's get into it. Okay, so as you've probably worked out by now, there are quite a few things that are bothering me about the way AI, or generative AI specifically, is currently being adopted in our society. One thing in particular that really causes me quite a bit of concern, we hear a lot about how AI means organizations will need fewer writers, designers, developers, specialists, and subject matter experts. Maybe that's true for now, which is why we've seen companies who are hyper-focused on short-term efficiency gains making cuts in those areas. But I wonder if this isn't a little short-sighted on their part. What happens to expertise when fewer people can make a living developing it? Can those companies really get by without specialists in their workforce? I think the answer to that is no, simply because of what AI is and how it needs to develop, and that is with access to human knowledge. Then the question is, how long can they get by without them? And what happens in the meantime? What will it end up costing them in the longer term? And what does that look like in 5, 10, or 20 years' time? So here's the thing about specialist skills and knowledge, and I can say this as a writer, a specialist myself. We don't just produce work or turn our skills on and off at the drop of a hat. Well, I don't do that anyway. We're not born with a skill and that's it. We produce expertise, and expertise takes years of paid practice to develop. Expertise isn't something we manufacture at university and put on a shelf until society needs it. People have to keep doing the work to get better at the work. So what happens if we remove the economic incentive or even the economic ability for people to spend their careers getting exceptionally good at something they're already naturally talented at? Where does the next generation of human expertise come from? Just to bring this to life a little, I'll share my own perspective on this. So I covered this in the last episode. I won't go too deep into it again, but I'm a writer by trade. I've written since childhood. I've loved writing since childhood. I've spent decades practicing my skill professionally. The writer I am today is the cumulative product of all those years of practice and skills development. But what if when I was 18 or 20, when I'd entered the workforce, what if there had been no viable way to make money writing? Well, obviously, I would have had to have found another career. Everyone needs to support themselves. That's just how the world works. I might still have written for pleasure if and when I had time. I might still have had my core talent, but I wouldn't have spent the next 20 plus years writing professionally for thousands of hours as I have now. And, I've actually experienced a mini version of this myself. So during periods when management and senior leadership became a bigger part of my job, I always wrote less and I could feel the difference. After I finished my last job, it took me a while to get back into the rhythm of writing every day. And I can tell you that my skills as a writer definitely didn't move forward during the time I wasn't really using them. If anything, they went backwards a little. Now, obviously, that's just my experience as one writer, but I think there's a bigger question here for organizations. When a company looks at AI and decides it can operate with fewer specialists or subject matter experts, it's usually looking at the work those people produce. So, how many articles can we produce? How quickly can we generate a piece of code? How much design work can we get through without a human being involved? How quickly and cheaply can we do it? Now, reducing those costs with AI might make sense in the short term, but what I don't think we're really accounting for is everything else that happens when you have people inside an organization who spend years developing deep expertise in something. Because part of what a specialist does is improve the way the work is done. So they also improve the work itself in the context of that organization or that industry, wherever they happen to be specialized. So if I'm writing every day, whether it's for a company or for a client or a small group of clients, it's not just about words or putting words on a page. I'm also learning and I'm seeing what works and what doesn't. I'm coming across problems I haven't encountered before and I'm developing better ways of solving them. I'm learning from other writers and I'm bringing what I learn back into the work I'm doing, and I'm doing it from the very specific context of that organization and the industry they operate in. Now, that's actually how a lot of specialist capability develops. You do the work, you encounter something difficult, you work out how to deal with it and become slightly better at what you do as a result. That really makes me wonder about all this talk of continuous improvement that we hear from companies. So lots of companies love to say they have, a culture of continuous improvement and learning. But I kind of wonder if you can actually have a true culture of continuous improvement if you're also AI first or heavily reliant on AI. Because that kind of implies that you're no longer investing as much in the people who have the specialist knowledge to improve that particular part of the business. My experience has always been that AI might be able to produce an acceptable version of something based on what already exists, what I might call a repurposed version, but somebody still needs to know what good looks like. Somebody needs enough knowledge to recognize when the answer isn't good enough or when the way we've always done something could actually be improved. And those people don't suddenly appear magically from nowhere when you need them. You develop them over years within industry domains and fields of expertise. And then what happens when you take things a little bit more broadly? So I kind of worry about what happens when you multiply this across an entire profession or industry. Let's just say it doesn't happen in one company, it happens across hundreds or thousands of them. Fewer junior roles in particular become available because supposedly AI can handle a lot of the entry-level work with little supervision. So there are fewer opportunities to practice the craft professionally at any level. Some experienced people might decide there's no longer enough work to make a living from it and move into something else. But what happens 10 years later? Who has become the person with 10 years of experience? And then 20 years later, who has the 20 years of experience? There's a real risk of stagnation when these people are pushed out of the workforce. Now, I just want to say here, of course, people will keep doing things they love. I said in the last episode that I would always come back to writing in some shape or form. People wrote before there were professional writers and people made art before there were professional artists. I'm certainly not suggesting AI is killing creativity, but there's a difference between doing something for a few hours when you can find the time and then spending your entire working life doing it. So paid work gives people the time and opportunity to practice at a level most of us simply couldn't sustain as a hobby. So at this point, you might be wondering whether I'm catastrophizing a little bit and whether I'm looking at the worst case scenario. So, is there actually any research or evidence looking at what happens to human knowledge as we become more dependent on AI? And it turns out there is. So I'm going to put a fairly large caveat around this section because I am definitely not an AI researcher and I'm definitely not an expert in the mathematics behind large language models, particularly how they're trained. I'm not going to pretend to be. But there are a couple of pieces of research I came across that I think are really interesting in the context of this question. I'll link them all in the show notes if you're interested. The first one is a 2026 working paper by a group of economists, and it's called AI, Human Cognition and Knowledge Collapse. And what they're looking at is slightly different from what I'm talking about here, but it's related. They're interested in what happens to people's incentive to learn when AI makes it easier to provide knowledge or make decisions for them. So very basically, AI can make things better for us in the short term because we can access knowledge without necessarily having to develop all of that knowledge or the skills ourselves. But this paper also flags a longer term problem. If people have less reason to invest the time and effort required to learn, you can eventually affect the amount of human generated knowledge available to everybody else. So this can eventually end in what the paper calls a knowledge collapse state, where people can continue receiving somewhat useful advice from AI while the stock of general human knowledge declines over time. Now, this is very big picture economic research. They're not talking specifically about a company deciding it needs fewer writers or developers because it has AI, but it made me wonder whether something similar could happen inside organizations over time. I mean, think about what happens when you progressively remove specialists from a business. In the short term, you still have all the knowledge they created, you still have some people around, and you've got AI there drawing on this body of knowledge that already exists. But what happens over time if fewer people inside that organization are actually developing the specialist expertise? Who's producing the new knowledge? Who's improving what's already there? Who's developing enough expertise to know when the AI is giving you something that's wrong, might be outdated, or maybe it's just not very good? I actually think this is where the short-term productivity argument that companies like to make starts to get really murky, because maybe you can remove some of the people producing the work today without seeing an immediate consequence. But if you also remove the environment in which people develop the expertise your company will need tomorrow, what happens in 2, 5 or 10 years down the track? Could companies effectively create their own form of knowledge collapse? And then there's another piece of research that makes this even more interesting. So in 2024, researchers from Oxford and other universities published a paper looking at something called model collapse. Again, I'm going to give you the very non-technical explanation here. They looked at what happens when generative AI models are repeatedly trained on data produced by other models rather than human knowledge. So basically, over successive generations, errors start to stack up and information can be lost. Eventually, the model's representation of the original data even becomes less accurate. One of the main conclusions these researchers came to was that access to original human-produced data is going to remain really important for future AI models. And that part really stood out to me because now we've got two related problems. On one side, we have research asking what happens to human knowledge when AI reduces people's incentive to acquire knowledge or develop skills themselves. And then on the other side, we have research telling us that AI systems themselves still need access to reliable human-produced information. And meanwhile, out here in the world of corporate work, we're having this enormous conversation about how many people with specialist knowledge we can replace with AI. And to me, this should be flashing giant warning signs in the world of knowledge work. We're building these incredibly powerful systems on top of an enormous collection of human knowledge, much of it created by people who spent years or even decades developing expertise. Then we're looking at those systems as they are today in 2026 and asking whether we still need to employ as many people to develop those skills. And maybe that works perfectly well for a while, but then imagine we get to 2036, 10 years down the track. We've had another decade of companies deciding they need fewer specialists because AI can handle much of the work, or the basic work at least. We've had people who might have once become specialists choosing different careers because they don't see a viable living in their original field. We've had experienced people leave professions because there isn't enough paid work available to sustain them. What does the expertise base start to look like then? So who's been spending all that time testing ideas and developing new approaches? Who's been pushing that particular craft or discipline forward in a commercial context? Now, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe AI will become capable of generating genuinely new knowledge in ways that change this equation completely. Maybe the nature of specialist work will change and we'll develop expertise differently. Maybe new professions will emerge around AI that we haven't even thought of yet that bring in some of those specialist skills. And I'm certainly not arguing that we should preserve every existing job exactly as it is, because that's how we've always done things. Work changes and it always has. But what concerns me the most is that no one really seems to be thinking about this at all at the moment because of the relentless focus on quarterly results and shareholder profits in the short term. So if you're leading a company today in 2026 and you're looking at your workforce today and thinking about where AI allows you to remove specialist roles to jazz up the balance sheet, I'd be asking another question alongside the immediate cost savings. Where does your specialist capability come from in 2 or 5 or 10 years from now when you need it? Who inside your organization knows enough to recognize when the AI-generated answer is wrong or mediocre? And who has enough depth of knowledge to come up with something genuinely better than what already exists? Do you plan to just rely on your current state for as long as possible? Is that really continuous improvement? Because if all you're doing is drawing from the knowledge that already exists, that's not really continuous improvement. At some point, somebody has to create something new. So I think the so what factor of all this is, we do need people to keep becoming business writers and developers and designers and scientists and researchers and all those other specialists whose knowledge has helped build the systems we're now using. And that means they need to get paid for it. And if we want people with 10, 20 or 30 years of expertise in the future, we need to think about how somebody gets the opportunity to spend 10, 20 or 30 years developing it. Most people need to get paid to develop that kind of in-depth expertise. It's kind of how the world works. And while you as a leader might be looking at your balance sheet right now after you've cut jobs and replaced them with AI and feeling very happy with yourself right now and giving yourself a big pat on the back for the amazing quarter you've just had, it could actually be a pretty expensive lesson to learn a little further down the track. Now, if this episode has got you thinking, I've explored the idea further in this week's companion article on Substack. So whether you're listening on Substack, YouTube, or through your favorite podcast app, you'll find the full piece linked in the show notes. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If you'd like more conversations about the future of work, AI, and careers, please subscribe for weekly updates. Until next time, take care.